Afternoon, everyone. Ooh. Welcome to the Economic Development Committee regular meeting of July 23rd, 2026 at 3 p.m. I'm going to do roll call. Brian Kinman.
Here.
Stuart Zimmerman.
Here.
Claire Halpern.
Here.
Michael Wall.
Here.
Chris Fox.
Here.
Aaron Teitelbaum. Not here. Necessarily absent. Mike Shadle here. Wow, that's impressive. We have a quorum. I will do the non-voting. Becky Patel.
Here.
Gary Fader.
Here.
Leo. Not here. And then our staff, Gary.
Here.
Myron's not here today. David.
Here.
And the mayor.
Here.
All right. Okay, you all received a copy of the minutes from the May 28th meeting. Can I have a motion to accept?
So moved.
Second?
I'll second.
All right, any corrections, additions, or discussion? If not, all those in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Opposed? All right, those are approved. Thank you. Good job, Gary. All right, we'll jump right into, we got lots of things to do updates on with regard to our various subcommittees. There's lots of work that's being done and we got some results flowing in. So Gary, do you want to start kind of initiating this?
Yeah, I didn't know if one of the small business committee members would want to start off the report or not.
I'll give a summary and you can explain where I've messed up. How
Sure.
about that? Is that a good approach?
That's good.
Okay, so the committee has been meeting actually quite often and quite regularly and having some very good meetings. The starting point, and we've been working on this for a while, is getting a good map of the city in terms of our vacant retail locations, trying to understand exactly who they are and get the data from various, the detailed data from various sources that are a part of it. That proved to be a little more challenging than we all thought, but I think we now believe we have at least I'll put it in the high 90% category in terms of quality of that information at this point. The second piece of this was then based upon that information, there's a couple things that have happened. There's been a discussion with some of the retailers in the area to get a sense for how they're looking at things, how they think about things, and what adds to value to them as well as to the whole neighborhood. That's a very early stage effort. In addition, based upon those discussions and just general knowledge, there have been some targeting going on in terms of potential types of retail that might be able to go into various places. And while we're not big believers in go find a retail and put them in, we want the market to do the work. We still need to be conceptual, to some degree. And so there's some of that that's been going on, which led us to the third topic, which we've had probably 3 discussions around, and that is the idea of a pitch deck. I mean, picking up the phone and calling somebody and say, hey, we want to talk to you. You should come to Clayton. It's a great place, isn't enough. So some materials were put together, marketing and advertising how great Clayton is. And the more we looked at those materials, which were good, we realized that a lot of the people we need to be speaking to probably need to be convinced that St. Louis is good, in addition to Clayton being good. And that's Clayton is the center point, perhaps, of your focus of, a move to St. Louis and an investment in this area, but it is an investment in St. Louis. And like it or not, our reputation is affected by the city of St. Louis's reputation. So some marketing in that area and the discussions about reaching out to Ron Kitchens and the GSL to understand better what they're pulling together and see if we can't combine that. So that's sort of where we left it at the last part of the meeting. And that may involve a discussion around getting some professional help at some point in time in terms of putting marketing materials together, but we're not very far down that path at this point. How did I do, team? Did I cover it?
The only thing I would add on that last point is that I think we've, in some prior meetings, talked about the role of the city in communicating versus marketing, and the idea that the city in the past has really so focused on adhering to a kind of strict code of communicating information, but not sort of aggressively marketing, that that's not entirely appropriate. And I guess a lot of us on the committee think it, whether it's appropriate or not, it's time to do it. And we need to find a vehicle if necessary to help market. And, we can't sit back on our laurels. We need to market. We've got a lot of competitors. And if you look down the road, we really need to sell ourselves. So, kudos to Gary. I think he's really picked up on trying to come up with how we can get that done and what that message might look like. So I think that would be a big step forward. Whether we need outside help, I guess something we can think about, but I think it's something we feel is important if we're going to sort of turn the page.
I think that's a good summary. I will also add, we get updated a bit on the other subgroups, and we're impressed with the activity and some of the thinking going on there. Examples, parking, the employee parking discussion that's been going on. I think that's very good. We think that's very good. Speak for the group. So. That's it.
Ask a question.
Yes.
And I don't know how much we're gonna get into discussion, but I'm curious, like, what we think it means to market the city. Like, what does that actually look like in terms of like where you go and who you go to? And does anybody?
Well, I'll give you an example of one. It was in an early stage discussion that took place some time ago, but we were, there have been informal discussions among people that are now on this committee about finding a central focal point of an entity that would attract people. And we're not just marketing to Clayton. If we're going to just market to Clayton people, we're not going to be successful. We need to market to a larger population, surrounding population, say, hey, this is a great place to come. And so, it's that kind of thing. Some ideas had been put out there about the kinds of entities that would be that way. And that idea was expressed to one of our commercial owners that needs to do something with a particular piece of property. And instead of being organized and thoughtful about the way it was done, they picked up the phone and called these people and said, would you think about coming here to Clayton? We can do something. And those people said, isn't that in St. Louis? We would never come to St. Louis. Click. So that's what's led to the idea of a marketing brochure about, GSL is really going out there and doing a big deal about, I forgot what they're calling it, Jet City or something like that, because of, Boeing coming back to town, the defense sector being back here. There's a lot going on in town, marketing St. Louis. Look at the demographics of all this. Look at what's happening, where it's shifting, and look at where Clayton sits right in the middle of it. You got to be kidding me. You need to be here. So,
Thank you. That's helpful. I think in the example you just gave, you're talking about going to property owners. Like, we know some of the prime parcels that are ripe for development. So are you talking about like kind of starting with them and then asking them to, like, helping them market their space, or is there another?
not necessarily, no. I would not say that's the approach. I think the approach is we're at the stage of trying to understand that we need to get outsiders to understand who Clayton is and what it can be, and let the market work. So those people start showing interest, that we're dealing with the property owners about, there's some interest over here, and facilitating the discussions that go forward.
I'm not trying to be obtuse, and maybe it's like too early to know this, but like, I guess I'm curious, literally, like, where do you market a city? Like, on the radio, on TV, in a particular news trade publication? Like, that's what I'm curious about. Like,
Yeah, we've had that conversation, and I don't remember if you were in attendance when Lindsay gave a presentation on the city marketing component, but as an example, as a city, we promote, like, when we do Instagram, for what followers we do have. And I think Brian hit it on the head there. It's not a lot of Chesterfield, Webster, and Kirkwood people that are following the city of Clayton's Instagram. We group everything together like outdoor dining. So we do Ivy, Oceano, and everybody together. We just don't come out and say, hey, go to Ivy or something like that. So we're talking about, and it's very, very early stages for the for the plan for marketing, but I mean, there's several groups to target. I think Brian was alluding to the fact that we would target like high-end retailers or restaurants that are not in the St. Louis market, and that's why we would use that pitch deck. We would work, if we have a specific location, we would work with a specific developer, say, the World News site or something like that to kind of to target that. And then, we'd also be looking at doing more active marketing that I think Councilman Fader was talking about self-promotion, about being kind of in your face with people outside the Clayton area about what we have to offer as far as entertainment, dining and so forth. But still very early preliminary discussions on those too.
There's like at least two different types of marketing or like efforts that I heard in there, right? One is like, what do we have in Clayton that we want to make sure that people in the broader region and our own residents and like visitors know about? And I think I understand a decent amount how the city has been approaching that. The part that I was trying to understand is like trying to get businesses who are not here and not invested maybe in the broader region or the central core, like get them interested in the city of Clayton and find out what's going on. So did I misunderstand that or what?
No, but I think there's two elements of it. I think what Gary's saying, we're still in our early stages.
Yeah.
And on the other side of it, I don't think we're going to be in the business of going around knocking on retailers' doors and saying, you need to be here. It's got to be a market-driven kind of thing. So it's creating more of an overall marketing aura, if you will, about who we are and where we're going, who's coming into town, who's in town, and getting people sort of fired up about the idea, I can participate in that too. The idea of, as we have said many times, think about why is it, and you may be too young to remember this, but why is it that we're a gas station in all four corners of every major intersection in the city of St. Louis and any other city in this country? It's because when you go to a gas station and you can't get to that one, you can get to that one. So they all wanted to be there. So the concept of creating an environment that attracts retailers because of the other nature of retailers and the nature of the opportunities and the nature of the vibrancy that's going on in the community is what drives this. So it's kind of both in terms of where we are, but we're still early stage. You're asking for specific points that we're not ready to
That's great.
disclose, if you will.
That's what I
Yeah.
just wanted to understand, like if there was subtext or something there that I wasn't.
I can give-
No, I think,
Clear
but,
about.
go ahead.
So-
Michael.
Just give a couple of examples. So
Thank you.
we did a project for Sam Fiorello and Cortex to help them get companies to relocate to St. Louis. Did a project for the Regional Business Council to kind of shed light on the realities of safety and crime in St. Louis versus perception and what drives it. And so my point is, like, we've done a lot of these types of things to it's almost, think of it as almost like sales enablement, where we're giving content to people whose job it is to go do those things. And if helpful, I think I've mentioned this before, but this would be a good opportunity to bring it back into focus, is that I have about 5 or 6 projects that prove in a pretty specific way what matters most to companies when relocating and people when relocating. It's all publicly available. So I can kind of package that up when we're ready to help with that
Yeah.
initiative, to kind of say not just why Clayton, but why St. Louis. It's actually a really powerful story when people actually know what story to tell. It's really good.
Yeah, and I think Becky too, like, because and it did come up in our meetings, but as Brian said, I think it's preliminary, but thinking about like to companies and retailers have to actually look at these trade magazines, you know what I mean? Or like somewhere, I don't know, so like understanding how you talk to these professionals who then go out and take our marketing materials and be like, oh, have you heard about Clayton? Let me tell you about Clayton, or let me tell you about the St. Louis region, and here are some opportunities specifically in Clayton. So
There was just an item in the Post, I think yesterday or the day before, about small businesses, and there's sort of a rebirth of small businesses. And so at least focusing on our subcommittee, I mean, I think part of the challenge is what would bring small businesses to some of our key areas, whether it's Clayton Road or Demond or Hanley Wideout, or of course downtown. What's going to make, particularly if it's downtown, what's going to make a small business think that that's a good place to be? Is there particularly if they're not from St. Louis, is it just will a place with office buildings and restaurants, and this whole concept that we keep working on of having a lot of residents live downtown and walk around downtown, this whole vibrancy thing it should lend itself to the idea that small businesses can be successful. And you get, of course, into parking issues, but that's what a broader committee is doing. But that's all those things that we're trying to get over, sort of misunderstandings and why this is a great place to be. And so seems like a very worthwhile thing to do.
And I think the other side of it is Gary has brought up, we need to, all the committees got to work together. So if we try to recruit everybody to come in right now and the parking situation still isn't solved, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. So it's got to be coordinated. So.
Always comes down to parking.
The only thing I would add to that, I think maybe picking up on something Michael said, each of these projects that has, let's say, a vibrant retail space that they're trying to fill, would welcome the opportunity to supplement their marketing efforts with things that are more city-based, that just you always, as a part of your process, do add a supplement about the local and the regional and the contextual area. So anything that can be added to that, pointed to, or even as a deliverable, I think would be welcomed by those that are on the front lines with that. So it's a supplemental effort, I think, shouldn't be overlooked with these pitch decks.
Yeah, I echo that. The word partnerships comes to me. I think everyone wants to know if they have a willing and able entity to work with, and so trying to convey that message through the various means, media, whatever it may be, through the internet, websites, but the trade organizations, the ICA of the world, the ISSC, whatever it's called, the brokers in the community, they all need to know they have a willing and able entity to do that. And it does require some self-promotion. I mean, I think we were all, when we got it, we want to, why does everyone say, oh, why Webster has all those little funky, well, Webster and Kirkwood, they're not shy about self-promoting themselves. And so I think that's some of the things that we're saying here. So good, excellent. Thank you very much, Brian. Great work on the committee. And it sounds like we got more to come. All right, let's go to Infrastructure and Parking Subcommittee. I wasn't at the last one, so I'm not going to give the summary lesson.
Oh, I just.
I'm at.
Mayor was.
We can talk about, the parking signs, I think, and then Mike, I'll let you talk about the employee parking program, but parking signs, we've been working with trying to make public parking more visible in Clayton, specifically in our garages, because we have a number of garages that have plenty of public parking available. So Gary came up with a mock-up of a parking sign that would it would be lit up. It would be a big kind of green pea circle, but it would attach to electricity that we already had. So, whether it be our light poles and, different things that are so very visible. He's preliminarily looked at some financial numbers for it. But really, we've heard from people so much about, well, we don't know where the parking is. So really making that clear to people that there are many garages around town that provide public parking throughout the day and into the evening. So really making it visible with the same uniform lit up sign throughout the city.
And then we talked a bit before about the restaurant employee parking program. It continues to get developed. It's essentially trying to move the employees of our restaurants off the streets, so to provide more on-street parking for guests. People in St. Louis like to park where they're going to go. They like to see visually. So having more availability and not have the employees park on the street is our goal. And of course, for many of those folks, it's a challenge to spend the money to park in a garage or some other pay for parking. So creating a program that is at a significant discount in some of our parking facilities, and basically working with the restaurant owners who would basically buy the spots for a period of time for so many employees, and then they can park at various locations within the community. So some challenges with that is one, we want to make sure there's a consistent price with all the locations that they're going to be using. Kind of maybe a test program in terms of how does it work initially here, how many spots do you provide initially. there are currently some retailers and restaurateurs that are already parking in the garage. Are they going to stop doing that and then go to the discounted program? How does that work? How do you kind of convey that? And so we're still trying to, we have a great framework. Gary has put together a great framework. We just need to get a couple more of the garage owners to be all of us consistent in how we manage it. And so that part, I think, is still taking shape, but very positive approach.
You
And
know,
then-
there was an estimate that, I think I heard that we could get 200 spots freed up in town if you got the employees to park in the garages, working out this particular deal. So I think it's very possible, and that should free up a lot of spaces, especially near the restaurants. And 200 might do the trick.
Absolutely. Gary, do you want to talk about the passport?
Yeah, so this is the current situation that we have. Passport, the parking app that city uses, allows merchants to buy blocks of time and then give those out as validations to their customers. We will be in the parking subcommittee talking next time about potential options that they may want to consider. One first option is just having this as it is, but potentially working with the city to discount the purchase of blocks for the retailers and restaurants, or however the program encompasses whatever services or providers that we wanted to include at some kind of discount. At the fundamental end of the day, the city incurs fees for the transactions through Passport. So, setting aside the fact that the lost, the foregone revenue of the parking itself, at a bare minimum, the city's going to incur some type of fee for the transaction that's taking place on the app itself. So looking at various pricing models to still make it a benefit to the retailers or restaurants, but not to intentionally lose money for the city. So that will be a discussion point for the next subcommittee meeting.
Questions, comments about parking?
I just had a question about parking validation in the evening. Probably the only place that I think my wife and I go where we use a parking garage is like going to Posteria, which has a garage a few feet away. You go in, they stamp your ticket. There may be others that do that, but it seemed to me like if you could get to some point of a universal policy where you would have a wider use of validation. I'm not quite sure what keeps people from coming here in the evening. And part of it is, of course, they can park on the street after 5. The more popular places downtown, it becomes very hard actually to find a place on the street. And so I'm just thinking if there'd be some way to get more folks to buy into this concept, it would be ideal if you could get all the parking garage owners to say they'd lift their gate at 6 p.m. But I know that's not going to happen, but at least a way that the parking garage operators would feel like they're still getting paid, but it'd be a lot easier for the person who parks. So I'm just wondering if that's something worth exploring, or is that not worth the trouble?
Good question.
I think there's two different
Yeah.
scenarios. With Posteria, it is their landlord that they are working in conjunction with there on the validation. If Mike in the ownership of that garage, say, worked with Tony and Kelly across the street at Almonds, I think it's a I don't want to say more difficult, but there's more issues to resolve.
Each parking garage is different. I mean, for our garage, one of the challenges we have a partnership now with the hotel. And so we have spaces, geared for the hotel. The hotel guests pay for parking. So as soon as we open up the gates for a period of time, it becomes a little problematic in the relationships and contracts with the hotels. And then also now we have condos and other types of things that are also sharing in the garage. So each parking garage is going to have their own story and their own issues. So those are just things we need to have people all sit down at the table and kind of talk about that kind of stuff. But to Stewart's point, you know, every little bit that we can get off the street is an improvement. Okay. Incentive Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mike. Well, I think if you've had a chance to look at your packet, there was a lot of detail slipped in there in terms of the policy and the idea behind a development corporation. So if you're seeing that for the first time, it might have been quite a lot to absorb. We were able to absorb it as a subcommittee. Mike, I don't know if you had a chance to attend that one, but Claire, we talked about it with Gary, and credit to Gary for putting pen to paper and trying to capture, I think, some of the main components of what we were trying to do as a subcommittee. And really what I'll say to that is what we were trying to do is bring out to the surface a way for metrics to be centered around the Clayton Tomorrow 2040 initiative and a lot of what was put into some of the current zoning ordinance adoption, some of those changes. So that was all done to try to bring these things that were most critical to the city in terms of revenue diversification, downtown activation, and those kinds of things to mixed-use projects, particularly focusing on certain corridors that would see development of scale that would most likely be a candidate for some sort of incentive depending on what they wanted to do. So this was, in summary, in my view, a way to create a scoring system, if you will, which was at the full discretion of the council that could measure qualified submittals against achieving these certain objectives and be a way to bring some science to how those incentives are allocated and then measured and then monitored. And the idea behind the Development Corporation, I think, just recognizes that municipalities have limitations. And I think we've seen it successfully implemented in other areas of this region, like our city with Arch to Park and some of the things they're doing to facilitate development. And it gives the city a vehicle with public participation or private participation to do some things, advance some things that are just more difficult at the municipal level. So maybe, Gary, that I'll set the stage and let you hit some of the finer points, unless I missed anything with that.
No, I mean, I would just, add that, just to piggyback on what Chris said, the development of the proposed, policy is based on the 2040 plan, recognizing that's what the residents of Clayton told us that they wanted. And just taking that approach and recognizing that, in some development processes, I think the council people that are here today have seen that sometimes that comes with a cost associated to it, and recognizing that reality, that sometimes they do ask for incentives, but if they're going to do that, at least we have presented them with the format of what our expectations would be in order to achieve that. And then really my final point on the policy, and then I'll answer any questions, is that I've been in economic development for quite some time and have been through several incentive policies or documents. And unfortunately, what has always happened is that as soon as the governing body adopted a policy, the next project out of the box didn't necessarily fit it. And so that always puts the elected officials in an awkward position of either denying a project because it doesn't fit the policy, or setting the policy aside and approving it. So I did, as I was crafting this, good or bad terminology, put a wild card in there for the council to say, no, this really hits a lot of other boxes that we consider important. So we're going to elevate this. So I thought that was necessary if we are going to go down this route here. And then just follow up on that Development Corporation. It is just a tool to really affect this, what's coming out of the economic development policy, the incentive policy, and the 2040 plan. Part of you'll see in the scoring metrics, and I don't I don't think we're obviously looking for final comment on this today. You know, obviously take the next month and look at that and ask me any questions that you would have. And we can talk about it again next, but one component of the incentive policy is, and it was in the 2040 plan, is trying to provide affordable space to small businesses. And so that development corporation really is twofold. One, to kind of vet those potential tenants. So, you know, what we have experienced in the past is that through the PUD process, we required retail and then it just kind of sits, for lack of a better term. I can't find a tenant or something like that. So if they're going through this incentive route and they've pledged this in order to get the points to do it, then, you know, ideally the goal is that this development group would have a vetted list of potential tenants to present to the property owner in order to fill the space. And then in addition, you know, picking up on what Mr. Fader was talking about is I can't remember the terminology used, aggressive marketing.
Might have been it.
Marketing. And then I don't know if this would ever be in the foreseeable future or not, but from past experiences, one of the real benefits of that is strategic real estate transactions, where the city, when they purchase property, gets into a public process and kind of the cat's out of the bag, and you can go to the city budget and look at how much we've set aside to buy your property. And so it puts us in a much weakened position to negotiate price and so forth. So kind of for the purposes of assemblage, just in a hypothetically, if we had a stretch of road that had a bunch of non-related individual property owners, and we were looking for the ability to assemble that for a particular developer in order to consolidate those lots and develop something in that area, that might be one way to do it. And then this group would also allow us the ability to put like a angel group together to potentially invest in some of these small businesses too.
Just back to the incentive, one of the underlying ideas on the incentive policy was recognizing some of the initiatives for workforce housing, retail, it's more of an experiential green space component. Those things are hard to monetize. But to the extent a development of some scale does work to accommodate all those things, which the community has said we really want, it's just a way to assign some metrics to those things so that you see what you're getting. For those things we've seen in the past, it can be problematic for a developer to really enter the benefit of a return on. Retail's the big one, because delivering the retail shell is one thing, but what we've seen is the inordinate expense associated with finishing that space out from a mechanical, electrical, plumbing standpoint before the tenant even will take over. And a lot of restaurant tenants these days are really looking for their landlords to put a lot of infrastructure in these spaces. So they're coming in and connecting fixtures and furniture and things. They're not coming in and
Building out.
doing a lot of that exhaust work and some of those things. So the extraordinary expense on top of the development expense is what's made it really difficult, and why some of these spaces have just had sat for so long under the PUD concept, because the landlord delivers the shell because that's what they were supposed to do. But the metrics just don't work to get an actual tenant in there, okay, for a rent that would make sense that they would pay. So I think what we're trying to do here is bridge that gap a little bit at the outset. So yeah, to Gary's point, I don't think the idea was to certainly have this be in final form, but we thought it was good at this point to just bring it to the full committee for review, and something that we could start to discuss and answer questions about, and ultimately get to a place where this could be something that we're present to the council.
And I, miss a lot. I've said miss the last meeting. I was away on vacation, but what I liked about what I read was that I forgot the booklet or the pamphlet. There's like a document that someone gave us from the state of Missouri that gave you all the different levers that you can pull. And I kind of create a one-page logic map, just kind of based on your initiatives. And what you did here is take that same idea, but tie it back to our goals and get much more specificity around kind of quantifying an opportunity. So I mean, this type of logic is really good, and you can turn this into a product pretty easy where you can just kind of input the data and it'll output, recommendation or consideration. So really well done.
Kudos to Gary.
Thank you.
Other questions? I'm glad there's a lot here. I think that we're gonna take, do you think in the future, Gary, that we'll be able to just dive in if we want to dig deeper into this? There's a lot of information here. Do we want to use a future meeting just to do more of a summary of it?
Well, I mean, so I sent this out, I think Thursday,
Yep.
perhaps. And so those outside of the subcommittee, this is really their first exposure to
Yeah.
it. So, I mean, I think now that everyone has it, they can take the month before our next meeting and kind of dive through it. And anyone's at any point welcome just to call me or email me and we can talk through it. Maybe if you could do that before the next subcommittee meeting on incentives, then I could, pull all those comments together, present that to the subcommittee, get their input on that, and then, kind of bring back a little bit more polished product at our next meeting next month. I mean, it's,
Okay.
there's not we're not under the gun for any specific timeline or anything. I think we want this well thought out, but as we've initiated these meetings, I think we've been, trying to march to a tangible product.
Okay, that sounds good. Everybody good with that?
Mike, I just had so it seems to me, Clayton has not ever done very much with incentives. The biggest was maybe Centene, which was kind of a disaster.
Hey.
But my perception with incentives usually, and mostly in the last few years, we've heard some of this at the council level, is we can't afford to do the project without incentives because of things that have happened in the last few years. Tariffs, lending rates have gone up. Sometimes we can't afford it for different reasons, which is like your parking requirements are difficult because it's too hard to finance the parking piece. There's that whole, we can't afford it. And then there's also this idea that we can't afford to give you what you want because we're not sure it's going to work. You want us to do first floor retail, and we think we're going to lose our shirt on it. So now what's typically happened the last few years is people who think that way, they do the project and they don't put anything in the first floor space because it's actually cheaper to do nothing than it is to try to find someone. So these are just sort of broad questions that I'm wondering how this approach is going to get at those things, because I think philosophically the city has to decide, are we going to be more flexible about incentives than we've been in the past because we have to be competitive. Other cities are doing a lot of this kind of thing. We've always been resistant to it. And why are we going to do that? So it just seems to me, I mean, I think there's a lot of good stuff here, but these are sort of broader questions that I think we sort of need to answer in order to really get at something.
I couldn't agree more. With apologies to Anna and the PUD and the planning process, sometimes when you create incentives, sometimes those incentives, the developer or the landowner, they look at them more as incentives to counteract the encumbrances of the PUD process, the zoning code, and the other types of things. So it's easy to say, okay, these are incentives, but if you have the process on the other side of the requirements, they might not be working hand in hand, and then your incentives really counteract or really are focused on trying to offset. So the goal of the city has always been to have this first floor space, retail, whatever, consumer driven, is a challenge. And so if that's really what the city wants, maybe this is just an idea. You don't have that, but then you create incentives where the incentive to create those spaces is significant enough for the developer to do that in addition to other things. And so I just caution you on looking at incentives just singularly without looking at the full picture, because the PUD process, the zoning may, and the other goals of the city may say, no, we want this, but then you have these incentives. Do you really get what you want at the end of the day is what I'm saying. So
I'm glad you brought that up, Mike, because as I looked through this and I didn't get through all of it in detail before our meeting, but I kept thinking about what we have in our zoning, and our director, Anna Crane, and her team have done a lot over the last year to make changes to our zoning to address a number of the issues that we have had in the past. Now it's new, so we don't know if we'll get the result we think or hope for. But I think that's incredibly important to keep in mind and to look at these together. And in fact, our PUD process used to be a points-based process that may or may not be what folks had in mind when this got drafted. But we kind of felt like that didn't work. Like it didn't actually help us achieve the real goals that we had as a city. And so we've like moved away from that. So I think there's just so much to consider in this area. And I think, I think that we have expressed openness as a council to incentives in the case where it's really needed for the project because of things that are unique about the project, whether it's truly meeting like a real tangible benefit that we've outlined in the comprehensive plan, or there's a real hardship about the property, or a combination of both of those, right? And so, I mean, that was what made it pretty easy actually for us to get to the final agreement we did on the most recent incentive for the 7-Up building. So.
My comment to that would be, I think all of that is fair. And I think part of the foundation of trying to bring some of this more to the forefront, so it's not as reactionary. We're just talking up front about what's important. And you'll see language, the but-for test is critical.
Yeah.
And that has to be demonstrated and vetted and under a pretty robust process. And then should you meet, or at least conceptually meet that but-for test, then how does the project meet those other critical components for the community? It's really just about the community benefit, which was all designed into the 2040 and the zoning changes, or all those kinds of things. So I think that was a little bit of the foundational logic behind it, without over-offering or being too proactive with the incentive process, because there was a lot of thought put into just changing how things are approved anyway.
Yeah.
I think, Gary, is that fair?
That is.
Thanks.
Okay, any other comments? That's great. So good reports from our 3 subcommittees. Gary, is there anything else just lingering with regards to any of the subcommittees that we didn't touch on?
No, I don't think so. So just as a reminder on on the incentive policy and the development corporation materials, if you want to look that over in the next couple weeks and have any questions or comments or suggestions, let me know. And then I'll be sure to compile all those and take that to the subcommittee, which would be meeting before our next monthly meeting.
Am I the only one who is going to need to ask for a primer on a development corporation and like have the chance to ask questions about that, or would it be valuable to do it?
We could do it. I
Wait,
could add that
or-
to the agenda for next month, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think I would like to hear more about it, examples of it. Yeah, I would
Right.
as well.
I think there's components in this that we need. That's what I was saying. If we need another meeting to do that, just to explain the things in it, because I think that would be helpful. Okay, so just action items from our meeting today. Subcommittees are going to continue their process. Everybody's working hard in between our regular meetings. There are some reports, documents, ideas that have been pushed out by each of the subcommittees. We're asking that this is your opportunity to take a look at what the other subcommittees, if you're not on that subcommittee, take a look at their information. And if you have comments or questions, don't hesitate to send those to Gary. Other items, action items, Gary, that I'm forgetting?
Yeah, so what came out of a product of last month not having quorum was, do we need to, oh, I'm sorry, no other action items. I've already moved on the agenda.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, no, I think that was good. And then, as far as our next meeting is,
Yeah, that was
So-
next on the
yeah,
agenda. It's
yes.
we just need to either confirm or change our meeting dates and times. I just had this conversation with the Special Business District group earlier. They've confirmed that they still like Thursday at their given time, but in light of not having quorum last month, it was kind of brought up, maybe we ought to ask that question again. Is this the right day? Is this the right time? For our meetings, I do anticipate us needing monthly meetings for a while.
okay,
Because we do have a lot of material that we're trying to cover. And then just a heads up for you, Mike, in scheduling purposes. Both the November and December meetings are scheduled on days that the city hall is closed. So we will need to either
so we'll
reschedule.
take a look at, so right now, our next meeting is August 27th at 3:00. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yes, all right, so make sure, if you do have if you know now, let Gary know, but we're gonna go with that one, as of right now. And then as we get closer to November and December, we'll address those. But our real work is in the subcommittees right now, and we'll continue to dive into those, activities. Public comment.
I've got one. Now that we finish these. You know, I think one of the fun things to do, and it wouldn't cost us anything, and I think it might be great, and it might get some publicity, and it might draw some business to the area, is what if we tried to make a list, say, of the top 20 medium-sized firms that are in Clayton? And they're pretty big, by the way. So, like, personally, I was involved in starting two of them, and now they're the largest in the country kind of thing, and they're still based in Clayton, Missouri. And as I think about it, there's probably at least 20 of those kind of companies. So some of them are big law firms, some of them are big accounting firms, some are big wealth management firms. And what if you ask those to come, I'm not sure what the meeting is, and explain their story. So either they started in Clayton or they started someplace else and they moved to Clayton and then they became big and they really like it here and they do such and such here. I think it would get a lot of publicity and it would help perhaps attract others to move into Clayton. And I think they'd all be happy to tell their stories. And I don't think it costs anything. Just a suggestion.
Okay. We'll take that under advisement, talk to staff about that and see what we can do here in the future.
Could also be part of our marketing.
Yeah,
Stories or.
Invite Washington U.
yeah.
There were some big public corporations that chose Clayton too. They didn't start here, but they chose to relocate here fairly.
That's true.
Do we know how many public corporations are in Clayton?
Most recent was Emerson, largest. So
Yeah,
they
and they
could've gone-
moved,
could've gone
and they
anywhere.
moved to Clayton. But yeah, there's, let's call it, there's 8 of those, and there's 20 of the next size ones. And they've all come to this 1 mile by 2 mile little city. So why did they do it? Why did they stay here? And if they tell their story, it could get exciting, I think.
Yeah,
Good point.
I agree. And some of this, not necessarily their individual stories, Stuart, but the small business group with those pitch decks. So I'm currently in the process, based on the comments from that committee last time, of zooming out to St. Louis and then zooming into Clayton, kind of addresses a little bit of that with the number of Fortune 500s and so forth, that we identify some by name.
You know, what you could do is, maybe Michael could help you get a committee of students at Washington University to study that.
Mhm.
You know, who are the 20 large ones and the 10 big ones?
Well,
I'll tell you a little
I'll give
something
Mike-
about them.
I'll give a little credit to Mike here, pat him on the back, but Caleres could have gone anywhere and they were under a lot of pressure to go a lot of places.
Yeah.
And it within the region and not in the region. And they've been in this municipality for over 100 years.
Right.
So they were determined not to go anywhere
But what happened to Buster Brown?
there. He's got to look for him. But if you look at what that's done now for a legacy office asset, it's been transformed. If you haven't been through the lobby of those two buildings, it's unbelievable what a retention like that'll do. But really, that was Caleres making commitment to Clayton. And so I think it's a good time because they'll be moving in the fall.
Yep.
If there's a supplemental marketing piece or a pitch deck, to have some comments from them as to why they did what they did, that could be sent out to comparable type businesses that
Right.
might be looking for a new home. While we do all this development of scale, that would be,
I don't know if you've got time at your board meeting, but can, like one or two come and tell their stories to to the city council? Then you could publicize those stories on your website.
Yeah, you got a lot of success stories here. A lot of companies that have made Clayton their home here in the last 5 years. So it's something to not be shy about. Okay, any other final comments? All right, no further ado, I will motion for adjournment. So moved.
second.
We are adjourned.